Welcome to Kinship Cafe. I'm your host, Jim Jones, and today we are continuing our journey through the Daodejing, and we are in chapter 65 already. Hard to believe how quick this has flown by. I mean, it actually has been a little while, but it seems like it went quick. So let's just
I
jump.
agree.
Oh, I realized I didn't set my what do you call those? The animations correctly, so I'm gonna have to do a little extra clicking. All right. So, and I see I didn't change my title. I must have been in a little bit of a hurry last night. So it's actually 65, not 64. But it is the Addiss and Lombardo translation. So at least I got that part right. All right. So it starts off saying Taoist rulers of old did not enlighten people, but left them dull. So this is kind of an example of one of the things that Taoism was really criticized about, in that at a surface level reading, it seems like they're trying to keep everybody stupid or uneducated or not knowing anything. And so the term here at the end, left them dull, is a little bit of a polite translation. The underlying word here is actually more like stupid. And I suspect that this is a bit more of using the term that was used against the Taoist here. So, when it says that the Taoist rulers of old did not enlighten people, the enlightenment part would have to do, I think, with how they viewed what the Confucius role was. And so within the Confucian school of thought, a lot of what they were trying to do was help to educate people to understand certain things. So there was very much this hierarchical way of ordering things. And in that hierarchy, there were rights and responsibilities that you had to those above you and below you, and everybody had to really understand where their place was and what those proper ways of interacting were. And so there was a heavy emphasis on education that needed to happen in order for more of the structured form of society to work. And of course, a lot of the Taoist critique was we don't want to do that. And one of their most colorful ways of talking about this was the idea of the uncarved wood. So they would suggest that if you're trying to get everyone to conform to a particular pattern for what you think the culture should be, it's like this idea that you're just carving people up like you're carving wood, trying to get them to fit into the particular location. And in doing so, there's natural resistance. So again, the context of the Warring States period, why are we having all this chaos? Why is everybody fighting against each other? The basic idea from the Taoist perspective is you're trying to force something into an unnatural position, and it's by nature going to resist. It doesn't like that. So they would argue for more of this uncarved wood, this naturalness that requires more of a move of harmony for how do things come together, as opposed to conformity, where you're trying to get everything to fit a particular way. So the response to this, then, in more of a pejorative term, would be that they are, just trying to keep people stupid or trying to keep them uneducated or ignorant. And sometimes these pejorative statements take hold, in the sense that people start to take them and use them or wear them almost like a badge of honor. One of the more contemporary examples I can think of this was, I don't know if you remember the conservative talk show host that was out for a while, Rush Limbaugh. And everybody would complain about his followers just repeating what he said. And they started to call them ditto heads, like you're just repeating. And initially it was meant as a put down, but then they adopted it and it became what they called themselves. And it became the thing to be a ditto head if you were a fan of Rush Limbaugh. So sometimes these pejorative terms get picked up and used, and I think that might be part of what's happening here with this idea of leaving them stupid, is that they're kind of taking up that, in a sense, mantle, right? And they're weaving that in here. Now it may or may not be that way. I don't see evidence necessarily that they were known as, followers of the way of being stupid or something like that. But this passage may be kind of using it in that strong term because that's how they were being referred to from the Confucius, or it could be maybe that they're owning that a little bit in a ironic way. So kind of an interesting, shocking, you could say, beginning. Why would they say that they're keeping people stupid? So then it
To me, it
continues.
says like they're leaving people to their natural, like simple state and
Oops.
not trying to complicate things for them, but just let them live and not try to, like you said, the uncarved wood, like not try to form them into anything specific, but just letting them be and
Yeah,
keeping
and
it simple.
that was definitely the direction that some of the translators went, where they would say, but kept them simple. Or in this case, it tries to tone it down a little bit by saying dull. But really, it's a pretty powerful word that they used here that I think is just picking up on probably what other people were calling them, the critics, how the critics talked about the Taoists. So yeah, kind of a, and this is how a lot of their chapters start, is they'll propose something that's like challenging, either as a question or something that seems like completely opposite or backwards from what normally is the way that it's perceived, very countercultural in their discussion. And so here you can see that, if they weren't trying to enlighten people, they're trying to keep them stupid. And you're like, what? How does this work? And why would this be an example of a Taoist ruler as opposed to somebody else, right? And it's going to continue with a similar kind of statement here. So we start off, okay, they're not enlightening people, they're keeping them stupid. Maybe this is taking up this idea that the primary role that the Confucians were doing was they had a heavy education agenda for how they ruled, and it was about, getting everybody to the same page. Then they could, understand how to essentially fall in line, how to fit into the hierarchy, right? How to be the round peg in the round hole. And maybe from a Confucian perspective, they would talk about this as being enlightened, and then they would talk about the Taoists who rejected this as being stupid or uneducated. And so here we have kind of a reversal of maybe what the common expectation was. The role wasn't about enlightening people or figuring out how to educate them. Instead, it was actually to keep them stupid, right? But maybe in a very maybe ironic tone, or, you know, intentionally subversive way of saying it here to really get the attention. So then it continues, and often after that startling opening statement, starts to break it down into how do we understand this? How does this play out? So it starts with people are difficult to govern because they are very clever. Now, this one can be read in a couple of different ways. So the one that initially struck out to me, I realize has much more to do with my contemporary context and how I have been approaching different social issues. And this would be along the lines of, you have to be careful if you're trying to control people, not to get them know too much or to be too educated, because then it's hard to control them. It's harder to control them if they can actually think for themselves, right? So it's a very negative approach again to thinking about the concept of education, because it keeps people from being easy to be ruled. So of course the liberators of a group are all about trying to educate because they want people to understand and see what's going on. So here, especially if we're taking it with that opening statement, can almost seem contradictory, because if the Taoist rulers of old were trying not to enlighten but to keep them stupid, then this could be taken as, because if you don't keep them stupid, they're going to be hard to rule, right? But I think this is actually taking this in a different direction. So we have the opening statement, and rather than this being a continuation of that opening kind of like shocking statement, I think what's happening here is we're starting to see a little bit of why they would have a problem with the type of education that was called enlightenment that was happening, that the Taoists are not participating in. And so this idea of clever here, one of the commentators said that if you think about the type of ruler that is frequently criticized in the Tao Te Ching, it's somebody who is in it for themselves, that they have their own agenda, that they're trying to make things happen for their benefit or their friends' benefit, or maybe they're acting off of their bias instead of being in that position for the sake of the people. And so one of the ways we might be able to think of that type of leader is one that is, what's in it for me kind of an approach. And that what's in it for me could be how we're talking about this idea of cleverness. And that if a ruler is modeling this what's in it for me approach, that this is going to be something that gets picked up by the people, that they're going to also think, well, this is what I need to do, or this is how I'm going to approach things. And if you get everybody thinking about, well, what's in it for me, then you end up with this chaos, this confusion. In other words, what the governor models is going to have an impact on the people that they're trying to govern. And if what they are doing is something that is incompatible with having everybody do it, then you're going to end up with this problem of not being able to govern them. And I think this is more of the direction that they're going based on that opening statement, is not that we need to keep people stupid so that they're easy to govern, but when you adopt this other type of criteria, valuing a different kind of knowledge other than how do we get in harmony with the Tao, it creates not necessarily educated people, but people who think of themselves as clever. And once you get into that realm, then you get into the place where the social confusion is likely to happen. You follow that?
Yeah, it's to me, it's like if your people are clever, then they're gonna, like you said, start deceiving each other or trying to do things for the benefit of just themselves or just a small portion of the group. And so then things start to become divisive and conflict starts to happen. And it's it certainly becomes more challenging when you can't have all of the people on the same page and caring about each other in the same ways.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
And
you see it today with the government. If you look at laws, like we have laws for a reason, and people are very clever and find loopholes in those laws, while everybody else tries to follow the rules that we all agree upon. There's those few outliers that will be like, well, it doesn't say this, so they find ways to uh, take advantage of that for themselves.
that
The
tends to have
billionaires that pay their way out of it.
And that has to have starts to have a cascade effect too, right? So it's like, well, if the people at the top aren't actually paying attention to the laws, why am I paying attention to the laws? Right? Yeah. Dane, you were going to say something?
If people are clever, yeah, uh they might they might see the laws of the land as not applying to them because they're special. I once heard a guy say rules are for uh dumb people to follow and smart people to interpret or something like that. And also uh if people are clever, everybody thinks they have a better way of doing things, which is how revolutions get started essentially, is in coups and whatnot, is somebody thinks, oh well, I can do better than this current government or whatever, let's overthrow them.
Yeah. It's you can end up with a system of control that is threatened by contrary ideas for sure. And yeah, very, very interesting. The different ways that education plays a role in how we think about uh, a community or a society, or how things are governed. We'll kind of pick up on this story a little bit at the end. I have some thoughts I want to bring back around to this idea, but certainly there's challenges with what, well, not, that's not the right word. How you educate people is going to have a big impact on how a community of whatever size is going to operate. And it's not that they don't necessarily think for themselves, but there's going to be like certain norms that get put in place. And there are things that if the people who are in control are acting in certain ways, it's going to have an impact on those that are supposed to be following or those that are subject to the rules that the rulers are putting in place. And that's really at the question where the Taoists are looking, is that there's a there's a kind of a natural cause and effect, right? They're always concerned about understanding these patterns, these ways that the universe works. And this would be a key thing that they're paying attention to, is that there's an issue or a connection between how people are ruled and how they respond to that rulership. And what is really interesting with Taoism, if it's actually holding on to this older indigenous or Paleolithic worldview that is bringing to bear in the context of this warring states period and trying to make sense of what's going on, the idea that there is a ruler, like an emperor of China, isn't something that they ultimately say shouldn't happen. They actually are in agreement that there needs to be a ruler. Just how that ruler behaves is very different from a Taoist perspective compared to some of the other schools of thought during the Warring States period. But it's interesting because it's not a complete reversal saying we got to go back to, these small clans and tribes and whatnot. It's saying, okay, we need to take the best of how that context worked before and apply it to this new context. And it may be that the challenge is too difficult when you get to a certain size. I think that that's what their goal is in terms of how they're talking about. And certainly we'll see as we get towards the end of the book what their ideal situation looks like. But there's probably something to this idea that you can only scale so far. And at a certain point, things just are going to become dysfunctional. And maybe we just have to understand what that limit is so that we can have smaller functional units that have different ways of interacting with each other rather than trying to make everything into one giant unit. I don't know. It's just some ongoing thoughts I have. Excuse me, I have. So that's going to continue. Therefore, given this state of affairs, ruling through cleverness leads to rebellion, which is essentially what we were just talking about. Not ruling through cleverness brings good fortune. A couple of different ways that this has been stated in some of the other translations is that ruling through cleverness is stealing from the country or stealing from the group, that there's something that they're going to be robbed of if you take it from this approach. And that if you don't rule through cleverness, then you're actually bringing this benefit, you're bringing good fortune. But it's definitely playing out this whole thing, that how that ruler approaches that job is going to have a huge impact on how people respond to it. And if we take that opening line, they're making that contrast between a style of leadership that thinks it happens through this education process of trying to get everybody to conform to a particular way versus what pejoratively is being called staying stupid from the Taoist perspective, but is really more about, leaving that openness to how things spontaneously or naturally occur. Would be the opposite of that in terms of how do we incorporate and bring into harmony the differences as opposed to trying to enforce the conformity. And it will say then that these two things, understanding these two approaches and understanding the enduring pattern, or excuse me, know these two things and understand the enduring pattern. So it's not very often in the Daodejing you hear the concept of patterns come in specifically, but here we have it being brought more to the fore. Different translations have it a little bit different, but it comes up with either like method or pattern or something along those lines. But we can see where there's this observation of what the world is like, and understanding how these patterns work is what the Taoists are trying to do in terms of how they engage and move forward in the world. So from a ruling perspective, what happens if you try to enforce this idea of conformity through education? Well, you end up with this unruliness or this rebellion, or what we're seeing currently happening, as opposed to what they're suggesting, that if you don't try to rule according to those lines, that instead what you'll bring is good fortune. And so they're saying, you want to know this, you want to pay attention and understand this enduring pattern. Understanding the enduring pattern, this is called original da, or this term that's being used for original can also be used as like either mysterious, or sometimes it's translated as dark. One of the translators has it as dark enigma. And this is what we saw at the beginning in chapter 1, where it says that kind of really cryptic line, that this is a great darkness, a darkness within darkness, the gateway to all understanding. It's using that same term, which other times can be translated as mystery. But I like this idea of dark that is actually tied in with this word because of the emphasis that we see throughout the Tao Te Ching of more of a reintroduction of the yin into the balance of things. So if we think about yin yang, the yang, the controlling, the masculine, the bright side, and the yin being more of the feminine, the idea of bringing in more of this generative aspect, which can also be understood in terms of chaos and this idea of newness as opposed to the control. So you've got this control chaos thing that you're trying to keep in balance. And so there's definitely, if they're evaluating the warring states period, it's a overemphasis on the yang. They're saying we need to reassert more of the yin, more of this darkness, and that ultimately, if they're saying that original da, or that primal da is another way that it's talked about, is going back to more of that generative aspect as opposed to the controlling aspect. And I think that's also a key component to more of this indigenous way of looking at the world that they're trying to recapture with this Taoist approach. And then it's going to bring that to a close in saying that that original or dark da goes deep and far, all things reverse, return, and reach the great headwaters. So you have, again, with that yin yang concept, everything transforms into its opposite. And you also have that movement between Wu and Ya, which is that absence and presence, and that what initially is in that absent side, the unformed side, the without form, moves over into the with form side, the presence, but then it actually ends up going back. So everything's returning back to the source, back to, in a sense, that headwaters. There's the reversal. Excuse me. Got a frog in my throat. The reversal of everything and how things return back to where they were is essential to understanding where they're going with more of their political thinking as well, right? That part of what can become problematic is trying to keep things a certain way instead of allowing for that transition, because everything goes through that transition. So if you're trying to hold on to it needs to be this way and we don't want it to change, you're going to run into trouble in the same way that you're trying to educate in the sense of bringing about conformity, which is an attempt to keep things a certain way as opposed to letting them naturally evolve. So this would be why they challenge at a fundamental level this idea of conformity, because nothing stays the same. You can't make it work that way. You're going to, of necessity, have a resistance because that's not how the natural pattern of things are. What are your thoughts on that?
To give other people a second to speak up before I said anything, because I always talk first. It's interesting the part where it talks about understanding and enduring the pattern, and the way that ties into like not educating your people in a way that like the Tao Te Ching kind of feels like you're trying to educate people. So it's kind of a weird meta of like, don't educate the people, but also we're trying to give you this advice.
Here's some
So
education.
it feels kind of weird in that way. Yeah. Like what if your people want to be knowledgeable about the Tao? What does that count? um, so it's kind of interesting to think about that, and just the perspective that the original writers had and didn't have, and that they talk about perspective and not having all of the perspectives. And it's interesting to see it in the writing, like come through in that way, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah. And
But
I
it's
think,
cool to see that they're trying to get you closer to the headwaters by teaching you these things.
yeah, and I think you're hitting on an important point. Because it's almost like an ironic thing that it sounds like they're saying don't educate the people or keep them simple or keep them, dull, but that's not actually what they're saying. Is part of the pushback is that there is always going to be, like with the concept of desire, it's not about not having desires, it's about what kind of desires. And it's not about, can you exist without learning something? Well, no, you have to understand and learn about how things operate if you're going to survive, right? You have to learn how to tie your shoes. You have to learn how to make your food, or what kinds of things are okay to eat or not okay to eat. And so there's all these patterns that clearly are part of the Taoist idea of education. So this is why they kind of have this more ironic pushback of, the Confucius saying, well, that you guys are just trying to enforce being stupid or ignorant. And they're like, no, you have to understand the natural patterns of things, and where the ignorance is coming in almost in an ironic way is when you're trying to enforce the conformity, when you're trying to impose the education. That's almost more of an ignorance of the natural pattern of things that they're saying that you do need to be aware of if you're going to successfully govern. Because if you're not aware of this, then it's going to blow up in your face. So there's this real interesting interplay that you have to read it at a very superficial level in order to take that dig of saying that they're promoting ignorance, because clearly they're not promoting ignorance. They're suggesting that there's a different and deeper nature or pattern to things that is being ignored through the imposition of this more hierarchical conformity that's trying to be imposed. But yeah, it's definitely an interesting challenge.
Jim, do you know Monk Hyun Ro,
I'm not
aka Arthur Rosenfeld?
Arthur Rosenfeld. It's not ringing a bell, but I may have. Tell me about it. Maybe I've come across
Well,
it.
he's a Taoist priest, I guess.
Hmm.
His name is Arthur Rosenfeld. He goes by Monk Hyun Ro. He's written quite a few books um, about Tai Chi and Taoism, and he's really into turtles and ecology.
Hmm.
But I interviewed him on this web show I was doing for a while, and he told this story that I think was about Lao Tzu, or maybe it was a different Taoist sage, but and I'm sure I'll get some of the details wrong, but essentially the Lao Tzu was the king's advisor, the emperor's advisor. It was like before he left and wandered off into the wilderness. He was the imperial advisor, and another kingdom was getting ready to invade, and the king knew about this, and so he needed to know where to position his forces to meet them. So if he positioned his forces in the right place, he could ambush the enemy and defeat them before they entered the capital. Whereas if he positioned his forces in the wrong place, then the enemy army would be able to just march in and take over. So and it wasn't sure if they were going to come like through the mountains or through this other way. And so Lao Tzu supposedly sat by the river to contemplate it, and for a little bit, and then he came back and told the king, you should position your army in the mountain, because that's where the enemy will come, in the mountain pass. And the way that and this turned out to be correct, and the invading army was defeated, and Lao Tzu was given credit for this. But the way he knew this was looking at the river. There were these certain particles of like a certain color, these like dark flecks that were in the water, and he knew that those particles were released from melting ice in the mountain passes. And if the ice was still frozen, they wouldn't be there. Whereas if the ice melted, then they would show up. So he knew that the mountain passes had thawed early, and he knew therefore that would be where the enemy would approach. And the whole point of this story, I think, at least what I got out of it, was that it's just about observing patterns. It was just through observing the patterns of nature that he was able to know this, that by basically knowledge of the world comes from observing these patterns, whatever that knowledge might be, whether it's political knowledge or military knowledge or any other kind of knowledge. It comes from observing the patterns of the world.
Yeah. Interesting story. I haven't heard that one before, but I like how he was able to realize, that something had changed in the mountain regions based off of the contents of the water. That was an ingenious way of making that determination. But really, the more I think about it, everything in life, including our science and the best of what we have come to know, is all about trying to recognize and understand patterns, how things do what they do. We may come to have a very good grasp on those patterns, but we don't necessarily know why. So we can talk about things like electromagnetism and gravity and the strong and weak nuclear force, and understand the parameters around how those forces work from a physics perspective, so that we can know how to expect different types of behaviors based on those forces, but we can't actually say why they do what they do. We're getting closer to explaining how they do what they do, but not necessarily why. And everything, in a sense, is like that. We can understand how the particles work to form atoms and atoms to form molecules and so forth on up. And we can then start to understand from more of a biological level the different kinds of rules that apply. And we can get into, the different ways of understanding the physics of how things move and how we do things in our world that give us a great degree of ability to predict things and how to construct things. But ultimately, all of it is because we've understood and learned those patterns. So it is kind of fundamental to everything. And I think what I find really fascinating with the Tao Te Ching is it doesn't get to the point of trying to tell you what the solution is. It tells you more of the methodology. And the methodology is pay attention to the patterns, not necessarily to the traditions. Sometimes the traditions are correct because they're been developed because of the patterns, but other times they can be otherwise or have been forgotten why those particular traditions were in place. And it becomes a very helpful critique and methodology for how to approach things, whereas most of once you start to get into, let's say, the religious aspect of Taoism that emerges later, or some of the other types of solutions, they have more of a spelled out, here's what you're supposed to do. And that doesn't stand the test of time, because you can see how they had some really crazy ideas about things at different times in the past compared to how we understand things now. And if the Tao Te Ching had spelled things out in that same way, it wouldn't be nearly as useful or helpful, because it would have been too much stuff that we had to dig through in terms of these cultural artifacts of how they understood the world at that time. But the basic concept of pay attention to the patterns, there's a way that this world works, and if you're working in conjunction with that, you'll find success. If you're working against those patterns, you won't, is brilliant. It's very simple, and it's not necessarily easy, but it's brilliant. And by just stopping at that point, it has allowed this document to be continuously useful, I think, in my opinion. But yeah, good stuff. Well, any other thoughts before I come to some final thoughts here? So this passage got me thinking about something that is usually a part of my wheelhouse and how I talk about things. And I am surprised to realize that I have not yet brought this to bear in terms of thinking about the Daodejing. And so I'm bringing it up now, maybe a little bit late to the game, but let's talk through this a little bit. And maybe because this one really brings up the issue of education is where this kind of came into play. But back in, gosh, I believe it was sometime in the 70s. I have to look it up again, but there was a sociologist, and I'm hoping I'm pronouncing his last name correctly, but his name was Paulo Freire, I believe is how you say it. I'll have his name on the screen in a second. But he had a very interesting book called Pedagogue of the Oppressed. And a pedagogue is a teacher or a set of teachings that you would do. And he went through this idea of recognizing the role that education plays in bringing about certain behaviors. And it was in South America, and he was looking at a lot of these indigenous tribes that were going through this education process from, the different governments that were in control at that time. And the thought was, the propaganda side of it was that they're trying to bring education to these poor, uneducated, little indigenous groups. And what Paulo is recognizing is that how they're teaching them and what they're teaching them had everything to do with justifying what that governmental agency was about and how they saw the world. So the way that they were educating them was trying to get them to fall in line with the ways of thinking about the world that the government was holding. And so he came up with this idea of what he would refer to as these codifications that sometimes were images and different ways of maybe storytelling that were designed to expose those underlying concepts that this governmental agency was trying to impose on them so that they could see how they were being manipulated. So it's a little bit subtle in terms of how this interchange works, but there's a lot of history in different groups and cultures about how they would use different stories to illustrate how a particular people group was being manipulated when they maybe didn't realize it. And so this is a very interesting challenge, right? That the education can serve the interests of the ruling class. And I think this is a lot of what's being talked about in this chapter is the Enlightenment. I put that in quotes in the same way that we would put stupid in quotes, is their way of trying to illustrate. It looks like these other, schools of thought are trying to provide this education in a positive way in order to bring about these good things. But really, that type of education is serving somebody else's interest. And so it's trying to bring an awareness to how those things happen and then how the people are actually getting used for those purposes. So then these codifications would provide an illustration that helps, let's say, these peasants to understand how that process is working. It's a way that education is used to control groups, and there's a way that education can be used to liberate groups. And it's this kind of codification that Paulo Freire was bringing up in terms of how these illustrations can be used to help the native or indigenous populations see what these larger interests are that are maybe not in alignment with what the actual people's interests are. And I suspect that's part of what we're seeing in this chapter, of how that enlightenment is being contrasted with the stupidity, and then how that gets played out and why the resulting pattern of that is dysfunctional, hence the warring states period. And that learning to pay attention to that pattern and the fact that everything is going to transition is key to working with those patterns as opposed to trying to impose something arbitrary on top of them. I don't know if that was helpful or not to bring this in, but I think it's some interesting concepts that maybe I'll try to fill out more in further chapters.
Jim, did you ever read Born to Run?
I don't think so.
It's a really great book by a journalist that's about running, and it's sort of about his personal story, because he was a guy who was kind of big, and his doctor told him basically, you can never run, it'll be bad for your health, because and it goes into how like running is one of the most dangerous activities, in the sense that like more people injure themselves running, like per hours run or miles run or whatever, than doing a lot of other things. And it turns out like if you run continuously for like a year, there's a really high chance that you'll end up with some sort of injury from that. and his doctor just told him, you have a body that just you can't run or you'll injure yourself. But he didn't really accept that, and he sort of went on this journey, and he learned about indigenous people in Mexico called the Tarahumara, who have a yearly tradition where once a year, everybody in the whole tribe, from kids to old folks, everybody, the whole tribe, runs like 170 miles through these rocky, rugged canyons continuously for fun. It's just something that they just do because they like it, I guess. And they run continuously for like a day or maybe a couple days, and everybody does it, and it's just their way of life. And he went and lived with these people and learned from them, and like learned how to run the way they do. And it turns out that the injury rate is the result of running incorrectly, and a lot of it has to do with the design of athletic shoes. And running shoes are actually designed in a way that supports bad running habits and doesn't support good ones, and makes you more likely to injure yourself. Because the Tarahumara, they either run barefoot or they have these kind of like very minimalist sort of sandals that they wear. There's actually a design called Earth Runners that are based on them that you can buy. But the reason I'm talking about this book is because there's this one Tarahumara village that all the Tarahumara were against being civilized. They didn't want to have roads built into the jungle going to their villages, because there was this one village that had a road built to it, and within a very short period of time, the entire way of life of that village changed. Everybody was addicted to McDonald's and obese, and they stopped running. And their whole traditional way of life just completely fell apart because there was a road going to the village. So it doesn't have to do with education per se. I mean, that they weren't like building schools or anything. It was just a road, but still, it was an example of this kind of older traditional way of life coming into contact with the modern world, and just sort of falling apart as a result of that exposure.
Yeah. I haven't heard of that book, but I think I've heard other people talking about what was brought up in that book, because I have heard of that tribe before, and it is fascinating thinking about how people run or even walk has been so severely altered by the types of shoes that we wear. And, especially when you've got those big cushioned heels, it's really enforced more of a heel first way of landing your foot when you're walking or running. Whereas if you're barefoot, you don't do that because it's painful. You actually go more of the ball of your foot first. And learning how to run without shoes, or with those very minimalist shoes, changes that whole process. And it's only because of the modern invention of shoes with how they pad the heel that it's kind of changed the way that we walk. So it's fascinating to see the consequences of that, and how people's like arches are no longer oftentimes able to really support themselves because they're using these arch supports all the time. Yeah, it's interesting how our interventions to try and protect feet and keep feet healthy have actually done maybe exactly the opposite.
Mine are messed up because I have to wear children's shoes because I'm so small, and children's shoes are always super narrow at the end. And so like the outer side of my foot is all messed up, like the bones are like almost completely detached from the joint.
Oh,
from that. It's been a lot better since working from home. I think it's actually healing, which is nice because it's been years at this point. But yeah, I had a lot of pain from that. just from having to wear shoes all the time.
It
Well,
is unfortunate because it starts when we're kids with like the sort of shoes and clothing that we're conditioned, especially females, even more so, are put into like shoes and dresses
Heels and
that discourage physical activity. Um, and it's true that that crucial growth phase that we develop that way, and it kind of it's very persistent. Like I haven't worn real, like I just don't wear shoes anymore. I haven't for a long time, but uh my feet still are not shaped like natural feet. Like natural feet kind of have this like splayed out look, but our feet kind of go like this. I had a friend who was from Italy, and she was in her 40s, um, and she was a yoga teacher, or at least a very very highly accomplished practitioner, and super flexible and fit. But her feet were still messed up, and she would always have me rub her feet. She was just never got tired of having her feet rubbed and massaged because they were still like deformed from her childhood, I guess. And it just once they kind of grow that way, it's a very persistent pattern.
yeah,
yeah, especially anybody that does like ballet or anything like that, where there's special shoes that you have to wear
yeah,
that are
yeah,
tight.
all kinds of interesting challenges. I have been fortunate to live where I live that I don't actually have to wear shoes. And it's been probably over the last 10 years, I've maybe worn shoes about maybe 10 times. I don't know. And so I'm either barefoot or I have like flip flops that I wear. And it's
Yeah.
been that way for a long time. And it's really hard for me to wear shoes. It's very uncomfortable, not being able to like feel your toes and having them move and be able to grip things. And yeah, it's fascinating to see, look at the different things that we do in the name of style or fashion that have some pretty interesting impacts on things. Um, that might be why I'm a little bit of a fashion rebel, in case you haven't noticed. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think about like wearing neckties and stuff and how that's got to impact
Oh,
like your blood flow to your head. And it's like, why is that? How is that possibly a helpful thing?
I
You know?
can hardly stand like crew neck shirts like this. Like it's not even really that bad, but I look at people with like shirts and ties on and I'm like, aren't you like don't you feel like you want to throw up with that on your neck all day?
Yeah.
Ugh.
But, I also understand there's certain times where you have to, you know, go along with the game because there's certain battles that you don't want to necessarily, die on that hill. But yeah, it's interesting the patterns, right? How does a human body actually function? What are the things that are helpful for the human body, especially if you're trying to talk about, performance, especially like a mental performance or even other types of physical performance? And why would we introduce these other challenges into it that are going to make it harder, right? And so this is again where we can take that criteria of saying, well, what are we actually after? Do we want high performing individuals? Then why aren't we looking at how to maximize human health, right? And making those our priorities as opposed to something else. And this is where that exposure of those ulterior motives of educating, we've come to see over the last couple of decades how badly influenced our national health nutrition guidelines were based off of all these, profit driven motives of companies that did not have our best interest at heart. That a lot of our public health policies were driven by other profit motives other than actual public health. And we're having to unwind that, and it's difficult, right? And even the way a lot of different studies are done and how they're presented, there's just so much influence that's happening from other sources for other reasons that we have to be extra vigilant about. How do we sort out, as sometimes it says, the signal from the noise of, what is actually going on? How do we understand what's really relevant to what we're actually trying to do? And this is where I think this idea of understanding the patterns and looking at how they work and being willing to shed the different traditions or cultural ways of looking at things in order to get at those patterns, very effective, technique in the Daodejing.
It's interesting. It's like our modern governments took the Daodejing and they were like, okay, let's do all of the things that they say not to do and see what happens.
Let's do the opposite.
Yeah, I was trying to think like for Palo, it was clear, like the the government or the whatever educating body was teaching them things that were not in line with their tribes. But at this point, like how do we see those types of things? Like today, to it's hard to know when that's happening today, I feel like, because it's not as clear.
Well, and we run into the problem of things like critical thinking not really being taught. We have an education system that's more designed to get us to be able to pass certain
Memorize.
tests and be valuable for certain, business interests, not necessarily education for the sake of education. And I sometimes get caught up in watching these videos where you have people having a reaction to music that they haven't heard before. And recently I so I listened to some what might seem very contrary type music given my disposition philosophically. But
Rap.
one of the one of the bands that I like a lot is Nine Inch Nails. And there's actually a lot of interesting philosophical stuff you can get out of some of this music. And I was watching these young kids that were trying to do a first reaction to the downward spiral. And it was so what was disturbing to me in this is they didn't have, and part of this is an age thing, part of it happens with, as you get older you have more experiences, but they didn't really have a good frame of reference for even understanding what they were listening to. And you know sure, some of it is just the time frame. They thought Johnny Cash wrote Hurt instead of Trent Reznor, and they were surprised to hear it on the album. They're like, what, they covered this song? But it was more that even certain terms, they didn't know what heresy meant or even how to actually pronounce it. And, it's like if you don't even have some of this basic educational concepts in mind, then you don't have the capacity to even engage in the conversation. So I have a lot of concerns about how we're doing education because we're not really training people to think. We're not helping them to be able to be critical. We're just trying to prepare them for a job. And that's disturbing.
Yeah. Also, it's not very fitting for everybody. Like I did not do well in school because it was memorization, not comprehension, really, in most cases. Um, and that hurt me a lot, I think.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, maybe we're doing some small part to help with the education with this program.
Hopefully.
All right, guys, we went a little bit over, but I appreciate the time. If you've been watching the video and you'd like to join the conversation, you can register your email at www.kinship.cafe, and you'll get an email with our latest videos as well as links for this live Zoom conversation that happens on Friday mornings, or information about where we meet in public if you happen to be in the Southern California area. All right, guys, we'll catch you next time.
Bye. Thanks, Jim.